I've got this character here in layout and I want to kind of dress it up. If I go ahead and do an F9, we'll see that, well, I've got this character. I think he's got a lot of personality, but his skin, the surface of his skin is just kind of bland. It feels a little more like clay than, living skin, living tissue. So what I thought we could do is take a look at fast skin, which is a subsurface scattering material node that will allow us to really bring this skin to life quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll keep that up. Go over to the surface editor, and right now for the base I've just got color, and we've got this color, but I'm going to go ahead and activate the node editor and load it up. Come over to add node, and under materials I'm going to choose fast skin. Okay, and I'm going to plug this into material, and I'm going to go ahead and do a render because it does have some default settings that work out pretty well, but in this case we're going to want to play around a little bit. Okay, so if I kind of compare the two, this is really bland. Of course, we're getting a lot of speck here, and I'm going to want to tone that down. But I can already start to see some nice warm color coming in. And if we compare it to this, this is definitely a cadaver versus this. But I'm really not satisfied with the look that I'm getting here, so I do want to make some adjustments. The first thing I'd like to do, let's bounce over here. First thing I'd like to do is I want to really see that subsurface scattering in action. So one of the things that I like to do is crank up values really high so that I can go, okay, this is what they look like really low, this is what they look like really high, and then find that middle ground that works. So for the epidermis distance, I'm just going to crank that up. Let's do 500. And for the subdermis distance, I'm going to do 500 there as well. So we've got the epidermis color and distance, and we've got that for subdermis as well. But again, let's just crank up some values and see what happens. So let me go ahead and do a render. Okay, so we can really see the subsurface scattering kicking in. This is looking less like skin though, and more like wax. So we can already see if, of course it is important to know the size of your object. And this guy is a little under 2 meters. And so in William's world, that's a short person, but a little under 2 meters. And so with a setting of 500 millimeters, we're getting something that looks very similar to wax. So for a candle, this might be a good setting. So I should probably jot that down and remember it for the next time I'm doing a 2 meter candle, which I'm not sure when that's going to happen. But so what I do know is that I do need to lower it, but I do like if I compare. Okay, so this is our original. This is with the default settings, and I'm starting to see it's looking a lot nicer in my opinion, except I went a little overboard on those settings. So I want to get somewhere between this and this. So let's go and jump back, and I'm going to say for the epidermis distance, let's almost cut it in half, and for the subdermis, I'm going to cut that in half, 250, and let's do a render and see what we get there. Okay, so I'm getting a little more definition back in my geometry. If I compare it to this, I was losing some definition now in like the lips and right here on the nose. I'm getting a little more definition. So I'm liking where this is going, but I want to bring a little more color, a little more warmth into this. So one thing that I can do is the diffuse value of 30%. I'm going to drop that to 0, and I'm going to knock the specularity in half to 40. I usually like to do one setting at a time, but in this case I know that the diffuse and the spec are going to be two different areas that I can work with. So let's go ahead and do a render. And you can see if we compare these two, see I'm bringing a lot of that warmth back in. So lowering the diffuse did wonders for the look that I'm going for here. Okay, so what I can also do is I can play with glossiness, and I can play with some of the various settings. A quality of 100%, it seems to be working well. Sometimes whenever I'm doing tests, if I've got a very dense mesh or a very heavily populated scene, I'll lower the quality down just to kind of get a rough idea and go ahead then increase that. You can also change color values. So for the epidermis color, I'm just going to drop a little more red in there. Okay, and for the subdermis, I'm just going to brighten that a little bit. Okay, so let's do a render and see what we get there. Okay, so went very red. So of course it's all preference. This might work for what you're going for, or this might work for what you're going for, but we can still see that nice translucent skin going on. Now one thing that we can do is I am going to drop that. I'm going to drop a little of that red out. Okay, so in this case I kind of liked what was going on with the default, and drop just a little bit of the red out of there. Now, we'll do a render with anti-aliasing just to kind of dress it up here at the end. But one thing I'd like to point out before I close this down is that we can see that we have inputs for all these attributes. So you're not limited to just an RGB value for color, for the epidermis color and subdermis color, and even the specularity and specular color, and the diffuse color and the diffuse, and pretty much all these attributes. We can feed image maps or procedurals or gradients or entire flows into these input parameters to gain full control over what we want our subdermis and epidermis to look like. Okay, so let's go ahead and just take a quick look. I'm going to go over to the camera properties, and I'm just going to crank up, let's do 12 passes of anti-aliasing. Just let's take it all the way. Okay, and there we go. So we've got our nice subsurface scattering going on. A lot more life brought to this character than, say, this, which is a cadaver. And this, we've got some blood pumping through his veins and underneath his skin, and it's really showing. So just remember a couple quick tips. Of course, I always suggest don't work with anti-aliasing setup whenever you're doing your test renders, but in the case of subsurface scattering and working with fast skin, my suggestion, try the default settings, see what you get, and then try cranking up those values. I went from 2 millimeters to 500 millimeters, so I went pretty extreme, and then found a middle ground that I liked. And also remember that it is going to depend on the size of your object. So what the settings that work for one size won't necessarily give you the results you're after for another size. So always have a good idea of the scale of your object, and play with some very extreme ranges from low to high, and you should be able to find that middle ground that works for what you're working on. So that's just a quick look at fast skin material node in the node editor.